Archive 13, The Scoutmaster's Hidden Trophies, The Case of Anatoly Yemelianovich Slivko. Introduction. The camera whirred in a small room behind the Pioneers' camp office. Anatoly Slivko adjusted the lens until the boy's face filled the frame, then stepped back to check the rope around the thin neck. The boy had been told this was part of a film about bravery. He smelled of soap, and the pine needles still stuck to his socks. Slivko pressed record. The archives state that the footage lasted 4 minutes before the boy stopped moving. Slivko kept the uniform pressed and the boots polished. Colleagues described him as reliable, the kind of man who volunteered for extra shifts at the rubber plant and ran the local youth group without complaint. He drove a black Volga that neighbors noticed only when it returned late from the woods. Inside the trunk, he carried a length of cord, a camera, and a jar of chloroform he mixed himself. Between 1964 and 1985, investigators counted 7 confirmed deaths, all boys, all between 14 and 17 years old. Each had been invited to participate in what Slivko called an experiment in survival. He told them the exercise would prove their strength. He filmed every session. After the boys died, he kept their clothing, sometimes their shoes, for weeks. The local militia received missing person reports, but treated most as runaways. One mother, Vera Petrovna Sokolova, age 41, a seamstress at the Nevinnomyssk textile combine, brought her son's photograph to the station 3 times. Each time, the duty officer filed the paper and told her to wait. No search party entered the woods. No detective pulled the thread that connected one quiet grave to another. Forensic examiners found ligature marks on the necks and traces of chloroform in the lungs. They found semen on the clothing in 2 cases. The pattern suggested a killer who needed to watch the body after death. That detail stayed buried inside the case files for 20 years. Slivko continued to work, to lead trips into the forest, to receive commendations for his service to Soviet youth. He married, had a daughter, and smiled for photographs at camp ceremonies. The camera stayed in the same drawer. The films stayed in a metal box under his bed. In 1985, a new investigator named Viktor Burdukov noticed that every missing boy had last been seen near one of Slivko's camps. He pulled the old reports, spread them across a table, and felt the cold certainty of a pattern that had been waiting years for someone to see it. He ordered a search of Slivko's apartment. The box was still there. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments what single detail on those films finally forced investigators to arrest a man they had known for 20 years. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Late summer light cutting flat and pale through the birch trees on the edge of Nevinnomyssk. Nikolai Alexeyevich Lysenko, 14 years old, left his apartment block carrying a small canvas bag with a change of clothes. Slivko had promised an overnight endurance test, the kind that earned a boy standing among his peers at Pioneers meetings. Nikolai's mother, Galina Lysenko, age 38, a bookkeeper at the local grain cooperative, watched from the second-floor window until her son reached the corner of Ulitsa Zavodskaya. She did not go back to the window after that. She would spend the rest of her life wishing she had. Slivko met the boy at the tree line. The pines there are close together, and the light dies early between them. The ground smells of rot and iron-rich soil, and the particular sweetness of bark beetle damage working through old wood. Slivko had been to this place before. He knew exactly where the low branch was. He knew the angle of the afternoon shadows. He explained the exercise calmly. The boy would hang by the neck for a short time while the camera recorded pulse and breathing. The data would be used to study human endurance. Nikolai agreed. He was 14, and this was a man he had been taught to trust. The rope was tied to the branch with a knot Slivko had practiced. He adjusted the position behind the left ear, the way a craftsman adjusts a tool. When the stool was kicked away, the boy swung in the thin light between the trees. His hands rose once toward the rope. Then they dropped. Slivko watched for 90 seconds. Then he cut the body down and checked for a pulse that was no longer there. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit profiler Robert Ressler, who studied comparable cases in the early 1990s, noted in his comparative report on necrophilic offenders that the retention of victim clothing and the compulsive filming behavior are consistent with a killer who treats death not as an endpoint, but as a preserved object of return. The scene is recreated, The trophy substitutes for the act itself. The perpetrator visits it again and again in his memory with the help of objects that carry sensory imprints of the moment. Slivko kept the clothing because it smelled of the boys after death. That is what the forensic record suggests. It is an unbearable fact, stated plainly in Dr. Elena Morozova's psychiatric evaluation. The body was buried in a shallow grave 2 kilometers from the road. Slivko returned to the rubber plant the next morning and worked his usual shift. The industrial smell of vulcanized rubber clung to his sleeves. His supervisor noted in personnel records that he was punctual and cooperative that week, as he was every week. No one asked where he had been. Burdukov would later locate the exact tree by the cut marks still visible on the branch after more than 2 decades. The height of the ligature marks matched precisely the length of Slivko's arms. He had stood on that stool and adjusted that knot with the same care he brought to everything he did. Fact: Slivko maintained detailed written records of each incident, which he stored alongside the films. Soviet investigators described this documentation as among the most methodical encountered in a domestic serial homicide case of the era. Pavel Dmitrievich Gromov was 15 years old and collected stamps. He kept them in a small green album with a cloth spine, the kind sold at the stationery counter in the Nevinnomyssk Kulturny Tovar shop. He showed the album to friends at school with the quiet pride of a boy who had organized something the world had not asked him to organize. His mother, Tatyana Gromova, age 44, worked the early shift at the post office, which was how Pavel had come by so many foreign postmarked envelopes in the first place. Slivko learned about the album at a pioneers meeting. He mentioned, without urgency, that he had a collection of his own, rare issues from Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia. He offered to trade. Pavel agreed to meet after dark. The meeting took place in the small back room of the camp office. The camera was already set up. The stamps were never produced. Slivko told the boy the rarest items were behind a false panel that could only be revealed to someone who had passed a test of trust. Pavel Gromov let the rope be placed around his neck. He was 15 years old, and the man in front of him ran the pioneers meetings his mother had signed him up for. The film recovered in 1985 shows the boy turning his head once toward the camera lens before the drop. That small motion, a boy looking at a machine in the last seconds of his life, is documented in the prosecution summary. Investigators who viewed the footage in the closed 1986 sessions are reported to have requested a recess after the second reel. After death, Slivko removed the boy's shirt and folded it with the same precise creases he applied to his own work uniform. He kept the stamp album. When investigators opened the metal box under the bed 19 years later, the album was still there. The pages still held stamps from the early 1960s, some stuck together by damp and time, the gum on the reverse dissolving in the dark. The militia logged the missing person report the next morning under runaways. No search party entered the woods. The second grave was already covered, and the pine needles had already begun to settle over it. Myth versus reality. It has sometimes been suggested that Soviet-era authorities suppressed the Slivko case for ideological reasons, unwilling to acknowledge that a decorated youth leader could be a predator. The reality documented in the Stavropol Regional Court transcripts is more banal and more devastating. The disappearances were logged in separate districts by different duty officers, none of whom were required to cross-reference youth camp affiliation. The system did not suppress the truth, it simply had no mechanism for assembling it. By the time the fourth boy disappeared, the method no longer varied. Slivko selected boys who were quiet, boys who trusted authority by instinct or by upbringing, boys whose families had taught them that a man with a title and a lanyard and a pioneer's banner on his wall was a man to be respected without question. He offered them a chance to prove courage. The framing changed slightly each time, adjusted to the specific psychology of the specific boy, because Slivko was attentive in the way that predators who survive for decades are attentive. He read rooms, he read faces, he knew which boy wanted approval and which wanted adventure, and which simply wanted to belong. The chloroform was used only when a boy began to resist. The camera ran until the body cooled. Forensic psychologist Dr. Anna Takarjan, who reviewed the case materials for the 1991 post-Soviet academic study on serial offenders in the USSR, wrote that Slivko represented a category of predator particularly enabled by institutional trust structures. In her words, he did not need to build credibility with victims. The state had built it for him. The uniform, the program, the commendations, these were instruments of access he never had to manufacture himself. That observation lands like a stone in still water. The ripples go outward a long way. Each time he returned home after a death in the forest, Slivko changed clothes, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and ate dinner with his wife and daughter. His wife, Lyudmila Slivko, later told investigators that he sometimes sat awake in the small hours, but never spoke of dreams. The house smelled of the same pine soap the boys used at camp. She said she thought his silences were about work. She said she never had a reason to think otherwise. That statement is not an alibi. It is a portrait of how evil operates inside ordinary domestic furniture. The militia files grew thicker, but remained separate. Each missing person report listed a different district. Each was handled by a different duty officer. No single detective held all 7 names in his hands at the same time until Burdukov requested the complete stack in 1985 and spread the papers across a table under a single lamp and felt the room go cold. 7 boys, a geographic cluster within cycling distance of Slivko's known routes, all associated with pioneer activities, all between 14 and 17, all reported missing in the weeks surrounding summer and autumn camp sessions. The pattern had been sitting in the filing system for 2 decades, like a body waiting to be found. It took one detective, one table, and one afternoon to see what 20 years of separate files had hidden. Fact: Soviet law enforcement in the 1960s and 1970s had no centralized national database for missing persons. Individual militia districts maintained their own paper records. Cross-district pattern analysis required a senior investigator to manually request and compile reports, a step that was rarely taken in cases initially classified as juvenile runaways. Slivko received a commendation for outstanding contribution to youth development in 1971. The certificate was signed by the regional party secretary. It was framed on the wall of the camp office. Boys walked past it every session. Some of them looked at it the way boys look at proof that a man is who he says he is. The camera was in the drawer beneath the window. The metal box was under the bed at home. The graves were in the forest 2 kilometers from the road, and Anatoly Slivko stood in the camp office in his pressed uniform and told the next boy that bravery was something you could prove. His name was Igor Vasilievich Petrov, and he was the one who came back. He was 13 years old when Slivko placed the rope around his neck in the pine forest outside Nevinnomyssk. He had been told the same story as the others: endurance, bravery, film. Igor went along with it because he was 13, and Slivko was the man who ran the meetings and knew his name and had shaken his father's hand at the spring demonstration. Slivko loosened the rope when the pulse weakened to a point he had not planned for, a miscalculation, or something else. The files do not resolve which. Igor fell to the ground and lay there in the pine needles for a time that he later described as feeling like the inside of a dream. Then he stood up and walked home through the trees. He told no one. Think about that for a moment. A 13-year-old boy walked out of the forest where a man had tried to hang him with a rope and went home and said nothing. He sat at the table and ate whatever was served for dinner and went to bed. He carried it in silence for 10 years. This is not a failure of character. It is a precise illustration of how institutional authority silences victims. Slivko had not only committed an act of violence in that forest, he had done so wearing the full weight of Soviet youth leadership on his shoulders, in a context where the boy had been the one who agreed to the rope. In the language of that world, in the moral grammar a 13-year-old had been given, there may have been no category for what had happened to him. He had agreed. He had survived, and so he said nothing. 10 years later, in 1975, Igor Petrov gave a statement to a militia investigator following up on an unrelated inquiry. The circumstances that drew him to that interview room are not fully documented, but once there, something in him opened. He described the camera light, the smell of chloroform on the cloth, the way Slivko's voice stayed level the entire time. One line in his statement was underlined in red by the investigator who reviewed it. The man kept talking about how the film would make the boy famous. His testimony would later place Slivko at the location of the 5th death with a precision no physical evidence alone could have established. In the 1975 statement, Igor Petrov gave the name of the path, the tree, and the approximate time of day with accuracy that was later confirmed by Burdukov's 1985 site survey. The ligature mark on the branch matched the described location exactly. The archives are silent on whether Igor Petrov ever received counseling after giving his testimony. The statement was filed. It was cross-referenced with nothing. It sat in a regional folder for another decade before Burdukov found it. He had survived the rope, then he survived the silence. The system gave him nothing in return for either. Mikhail Sergeyevich Sidorov was 16 years old and had already decided on his future. Technical school, possibly engineering. He kept a small spiral notebook in his jacket pocket, the kind sold in packets of 3, and in it he had written the names of 3 friends he planned to write letters to once the school year began and the distances between people expanded, the way they do in that particular autumn when childhood ends and the next thing has not yet started. Slivko invited him to the camp for a final endurance test before the term. The framing this time was that Mikhail would be the subject of a documentary about Soviet youth, his face on film, his courage on record. He was 16, and the idea of being seen and remembered was not nothing. He arrived at the camp on a Tuesday evening. The light was already failing between the trees. The film shows the same procedure as the 6 before it. The preparation, the rope, the drop, the stillness. Slivko waited longer after the fall than he had with the previous boys. The forensic report on Mikhail Sidorov notes that the post-mortem interval indicators suggested the body remained at the scene for a period consistent with extended observation before burial. Slivko was watching. The record does not speculate further on what he was doing during those minutes. It does not need to. When he cut the body down, the face had already changed color in the way that faces change when blood pools and oxygen is gone, and the thing that made a person has departed. He buried Mikhail Sidorov near the others and returned the notebook to the metal box under the bed. The 3 names in that notebook were never contacted by the militia. Those 3 friends waited for a letter that the archive suggests never came and may never have known why. 3 weeks after Mikhail Sidorov was buried in the forest, Viktor Burdukov arrived at Slivko's apartment with a warrant and 2 officers. It was morning. The smell of boiled cabbage and old wood came from the stairwell. Slivko answered the door in his work clothes. The box was under the bed where it had always been. It was opened under fluorescent light in the small bedroom. The films were numbered 1 through 7 in Slivko's own handwriting, neat numbers, the same hand that had signed commendation forms and written up camp rosters and noted the names of boys who showed particular promise. 7 numbers, 7 boys, 7 graves in the pine forest, 2 kilometers from the road. The morning of the arrest, Viktor Burdukov later described as the quietest of his career. He had expected resistance of some kind, not physical necessarily. Slivko was not a physically imposing man, and the 2 officers with Burdukov were large and unhurried in the way of experienced militia, but resistance of the soul, denial, the operatic performance of innocence that guilty men so often produce at the threshold moment when the door opens and the warrant is visible in the investigator's hand. Slivko produced none of it. He sat down at the kitchen table when they entered, and he asked, in a voice that witnesses later described as conversational, whether they had brought the films, as though the films were a shared project, as though he and Burdukov had been collaborating on something, and he was curious about the progress. He did not resist, he did not weep, he did not call for his wife. He folded his hands on the kitchen table and waited. In the car to the station, he told the driver, without being asked, that the boys had agreed to everything, that they had understood the nature of the exercise and had consented freely, and that the films would confirm this. The driver, a militia sergeant, whose name appears only as D. Orlov in the transport log, did not reply. The car moved through the morning streets of Nevinnomyssk, a city going about its Tuesday, bread being carried home, buses running on their routes, children walking to school. Slivko watched all of it through the window with the same level expression he had worn for 20 years. At the station, he gave a full, voluntary statement within 2 hours. This was not the compliance of a man who had prepared a defense. This was something else, something colder. He described each death in the precise sequence the films were numbered. He used the boys' full names without hesitation or pause. He supplied dates, locations, methods. He corrected one small factual error in Burdukov's preliminary notes without being prompted. When the interviewing detective asked why he had kept the clothing, Slivko answered that the material helped him remember the expressions on their faces. He said it the way a person says a thing that seems obvious to them, the way you might explain to someone why you keep a photograph. Dr. Elena Morozova, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to the case, would later write in her evaluation that this response was among the most diagnostic she had encountered in 30 years of practice. There was no recognition of transgression in the statement, she wrote. He was describing a memory system, a filing method. He did not understand or did not acknowledge that there was any other way to hear what he was saying. Fact, Slivko's voluntary confession included geographic details that allowed investigators to locate 3 graves that had not previously been discovered. In each case, the remains were found within a 2-meter radius of the coordinates he provided from memory. Myth versus reality. It was reported in several post-Soviet accounts that Slivko confessed because he wanted the films to be seen. This is not supported by the trial transcripts. His statements focused consistently on the accuracy of the documentation rather than on any desire for public recognition. The more precise characterization from the prosecution record is that he treated the confession as an administrative act, a transfer of files to new custodians. The officers who processed Slivko at the station that morning noted in their shift log that he asked twice about the condition of the films, whether the reels had been stored correctly, whether there was any risk of damage from exposure to light. He was worried about the archive. The courtroom in Stavropol held 80 people on wooden benches that creaked when anyone shifted their weight. The families of the 7 boys occupied the left side of the room. They had not all met before. Some had been searching alone for years, each carrying a private grief in a separate part of the same city, unaware that the woman sitting in the next row at the post office or the man ahead of them at the bread queue might be doing the same. They sat together now. The creaking wood and the fluorescent hum of the court lights and the terrible intimacy of shared ruin. Slivko wore the same gray suit each day of the trial. He sat upright in the defendant's chair and answered questions in a steady voice and never raised it. He did not perform contrition. He did not perform anything. He appeared to occupy the courtroom the way he had occupied every room of his life, with a composed and functional blankness that witnesses described as more disturbing than rage would have been. The prosecutor played excerpts from the films on the 3rd day of trial. The projector was set up at the front of the room. Its fan was audible in the silence before the images appeared. Several family members had been warned what they would see. Several had declined to attend that session. Those who remained sat with the particular stillness of people who have already rehearsed the worst in their minds and are discovering that the worst is worse than the rehearsal. One mother covered her ears. The judge ordered the film stopped after the 3rd minute. Slivko watched the screen without expression until it went dark. Then he turned back to the room and waited for the next question. Fact: the trial transcripts of case number 412x86 record that the court heard testimony from 14 witnesses over 11 days. The forensic film evidence was the central exhibit. The defense did not challenge the authenticity of any film. The testimony of the surviving witness, Igor Vasilyevich Petrov, now 23, was delivered on the 7th day. He spoke for 40 minutes. He did not look at Slivko during his statement. At the conclusion of his testimony, one of the family members on the left bench reached across and took his hand. The gesture is not recorded in the official transcript. It was observed by the court reporter and included in a personal account published in a Stavropol regional newspaper in 1991. The defense called 3 character witnesses: a former colleague from the rubber plant, a neighbor, a retired pioneers administrator who had signed Slivko's commendations. Each described the same man: reliable, dedicated, quiet, the kind of man you did not worry about, the kind of man who had access to your children. Dr. Elena Morozova spent 6 weeks examining Anatoly Slivko. She met with him 23 times in a secure examination room at the Stavropol Regional Psychiatric Facility. She was 51 years old, a forensic psychiatrist with 3 decades of experience in Soviet criminal evaluation, and she later said in a 1991 interview that the Slivko sessions were the most technically demanding of her career, not because of his complexity, but because of his simplicity. He was not fragmented. He was not confused. He did not dissociate during their conversations or present the chaotic internal landscape she had learned to expect in cases of severe violence. He was organized, coherent. He had a consistent internal logic that explained his behavior to his own satisfaction completely. He had conducted experiments. He had documented the results. The subjects had agreed. The documentation was thorough. He could not understand what required psychiatric examination. Morozova's report, filed with the Ministry of Health in 1986, noted that Slivko became animated only when discussing the technical quality of the films. He criticized the lighting in 2 of the earlier reels and expressed frustration that the camera he had used from 1967 onward had introduced a tracking instability in the lower third of the frame. He described this as a significant limitation on the evidentiary value of those recordings. He was not talking about murder. He was talking about archival standards. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of the case have sometimes portrayed Slivko as a man driven by uncontrollable compulsion, a figure of tragic psychological imprisonment. Dr. Morozova's evaluation explicitly rejected this framing. She found no evidence of psychotic break, dissociative disorder, or impaired impulse control. Her conclusion was unambiguous. Slivko knew what he was doing, understood that it was prohibited by law and social norm, and chose to do it anyway because it satisfied him. Legal sanity was confirmed. Moral vacancy was noted. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit research from the same era described this profile with clinical precision. Agents studying comparable cases in the early 1990s identified a category of offender who uses institutional affiliation not merely as access, but as identity reinforcement. The uniform is not a disguise. It is the perpetrator's genuine self-concept. He is the youth leader. He is the reliable colleague. He is the man the party commended. The violence is a parallel life conducted in the same body, and the body shows no sign of carrying both. Morozova noted that Slivko never used the word wrong in any of their 23 sessions, not once. She tested for it indirectly. She presented moral scenarios. She used hypothetical framings. Each time, his response mapped the acts onto a framework of documentation and consent in which wrong did not appear as a concept. The report concluded, legally sane, fully culpable, exhibiting no remorse, not suitable for psychiatric disposition. He was returned to the legal system and its judgment. The search teams entered the forest in the spring of 1986. The snow had retreated from the higher ground, and the ground itself was soft, cooperative in the way that ground becomes when winter releases it, and the pine smell was everywhere, rich and specific, the smell of the forest where 7 boys had been buried over 20 years. They worked with maps Slivko had drawn from memory in the confession sessions with Burdukov. The maps were precise. He had remembered the landmarks correctly. A split boulder near the 3rd grave, a section of collapsed fencing near the 5th, a dry creek bed that ran east of the burial cluster and served as a navigational reference. The man who had buried these boys had also mapped them with the care of a surveyor. The first grave was located on the morning of the 2nd day. The remains were partial, consistent with 2 decades of exposure to root systems and moisture, and the patient work of the earth reclaiming what had been placed in it. A forensic odontologist from the Stavropol Regional Medical Examiner's Office worked the site alongside the search team. It took 4 days to recover all 7 sets of remains. Each body was identified through a combination of dental records, clothing artifacts, and in 3 cases, the personal items buried with or near the remains. Pavel Gromov's stamp album, logged from the metal box, was cross-referenced against a specific stamp variety found in the soil matrix near the 2nd grave, a 1962 East German commemorative issue. The edges browned, but the printing still legible. A boy's collection, returned to the earth, evidence now. The families were notified on the same day, a Tuesday in late April 1986, by officers assigned 1 family per notification. The sessions were conducted at the families' homes where possible. The procedure is documented in the family notification log maintained by the Stavropol Prosecutor's Office under the name of Anna Sidorova, the case coordinator. One father, Alexei Lysenko, Nikolai's father, asked to keep his son's shoes. The shoes had been logged as physical evidence in the Slivko case file. The request was denied. Alexei Lysenko thanked the officer, shook his hand, and closed the door. The notification log records the time as 14:47. It records nothing else. Vera Petrovna Sokolova, who had brought her son's photograph to the militia station 3 times, who had been told 3 times to wait, sat in her kitchen on that Tuesday afternoon and received the confirmation of what some part of her had known for years. The investigator who delivered the notification later wrote in a personal account that she did not cry during his visit. She made tea. She asked whether her son's grave would be marked. He told her that arrangements were being made. She nodded and looked out the window at the street below. She had been waiting for news for years. Now the news had arrived, and the waiting was a different kind of waiting. Fact: the Stavropol regional authorities arranged individual reburials for each of the 7 victims in their home district cemeteries in the summer of 1986. The graves were marked with standard Soviet civilian headstones. Vera Sokolova's son received a stone with his full name and dates. She visited it the following Sunday, and every Sunday after that, according to a neighbor's account recorded in the 1991 newspaper retrospective. Search team leader Captain Dmitry Voronov, in his operational report filed with the MVD, noted that the graves were arranged in no apparent spatial pattern. They were not clustered. They were not in a line. They were distributed through the forest in a configuration that suggested Slivko had chosen each location independently, perhaps based on soil depth or concealment from path sightlines, rather than organizing them into any deliberate geography. 7 graves scattered through the pines, not a monument, not a pattern with meaning, just the pragmatic decisions of a man disposing of evidence. That absence of meaning, that pure functionality of death, was in some ways the most disturbing finding in the operational report. The investigator who processed the report added a handwritten note in the margin. It said only, "There is nothing here but what he did." The court delivered its verdict on a gray morning in late 1986. The room held the same 80 people on the same creaking benches, the families on the left, the procedural machinery of Soviet justice arrayed at the front. Slivko in his gray suit. The sentence was death. He accepted the verdict without comment. No visible reaction passed across his face. He was led from the room with the same composed efficiency he had demonstrated throughout the proceedings. The door closed. The families sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a verdict, which is not relief and is not grief and is not quite either of those things but something adjacent to both of them that does not have a precise name. Appeals were filed by the defense on procedural grounds and were rejected at the regional level and subsequently at the federal level. The process took time, as such processes do, the machinery grinding through its stages while the families waited, and Slivko sat in a cell, and the metal box of films sat in the evidence room, and the notebooks and stamp albums and the small spiral notebook with 3 names sat in sealed bags with case numbers on them. The execution took place in 1989. The method was the standard Soviet practice for capital sentences, a single pistol shot to the back of the head, administered without prior notice to the condemned. This was the system's design, to deny the prisoner the psychological preparation that advanced knowledge would allow. The archives contain the official notice of execution issued by the relevant authority. It records the date and the confirmation of sentence carried out. It records nothing further. Fact: the Soviet Union carried out capital punishment by a single shot to the back of the head, administered typically within hours of final rejection of appeal, without informing the prisoner of the precise timing. This method was codified in Soviet criminal procedure and applied to all capital sentences during this period. No family members were notified of the execution date in advance. Vera Petrovna Sokolova learned of it from a neighbor who had heard it on the radio. She was standing at the kitchen sink. She finished washing the cup she was holding before she sat down. The 7 reels were sealed in evidence packaging in October 1985 and transferred to the Stavropol Regional Court Evidence Repository upon the filing of charges. They remained there through the trial and the appeals process and the execution and the years that followed. In 1991, with the Soviet Union entering its final stage of dissolution and institutional archives beginning to shift between jurisdictions, portions of the Slivko case materials were transferred to the Central Archive of the FSB, where they were designated restricted under Reference 17/89. A subset of the film evidence was made available in closed sessions for the training of investigators specializing in homicide pattern analysis. The sessions were conducted under strict protocols. No external viewing was permitted. The reels were returned to sealed storage after each session. No copies of the films were released to the public. None have been. The camera itself, the device Slivko had used from 1967 through 1985, was logged separately from the film reels. It was cataloged as physical evidence under its serial number and manufacturer designation, a Soviet-made device of the type standard to amateur documentary use in the 1960s and stored in a different section of the evidence repository. The separation was procedural. Films and recording devices were handled under different evidence protocols. Myth versus reality. Accounts in several post-Soviet publications claimed the films were destroyed following the execution to spare the families further distress. The Central Archive of the FSB records reviewed for this case indicate this is not accurate. The materials were retained under restricted classification. The retention was standard procedure for capital case evidence. Whether any decision was made about long-term disposition after the restricted training use ceased is not reflected in the documents available to researchers. Viktor Burdukov, the investigator who had opened the box and spread the films across his desk in 1985, was not among the officers who viewed the training sessions. He had transferred to a different division by the time those sessions were conducted. The case files record no further professional contact between Burdukov and the Slivko materials after the verdict. Vera Petrovna Sokolova wrote to the court 3 times between 1986 and 1989. The letters requested the return of her son's notebook, the small spiral notebook Mikhail had carried in his jacket pocket on the last night of his life, the one with 3 names written inside it. She received no reply to the first letter. She received a form acknowledgement to the second, noting that evidence materials in capital cases were retained under statutory provisions and not eligible for return during active judicial proceedings. She received nothing in response to the third. The notebook remained in the evidence repository until at least 1992, when it was included in an inventory of retained Slivko case materials transferred to the FSB archive. Its current location is not reflected in any document accessible to researchers at the time of this record. 3 names written in a dead boy's handwriting, somewhere in an archive, filed. This is not an unusual circumstance in Soviet criminal records management. Families of victims in capital cases routinely found that the personal effects of their children had passed into the bureaucratic system and could not be extracted from it. The system had its own relationship with objects. Once an object entered evidence, it belonged to the file belonged to the state. The 3 friends whose names Mikhail had written in the notebook, their identities are not included in any publicly accessible case document. Whether they knew Mikhail was gone, whether they eventually learned how he died, whether any of them knew that their names were in his pocket on the night he walked into the forest, is not recorded. 3 names, 3 ordinary people who had been placed in a notebook by a boy who intended to write to them once the school term began. They received no letter. Fact: Soviet evidentiary law provided no consistent mechanism for the return of non-weapon, non-document personal property to victim families following the conclusion of capital proceedings. The legal framework simply did not address the category. Family requests were handled at the discretion of individual case administrators, which in practice meant they were rarely addressed at all. Viktor Burdukov retired from the militia in 1994 after 31 years of service. He gave a single extended interview that year to a regional journalist, documenting changes in Soviet-era criminal investigation practices in the post-Soviet period. He spoke about the Slivko case for 40 minutes of the 2-hour interview. He described how he had first noticed the geographic cluster in the missing persons stack. He described the drive to the apartment, the warrant, the box on the kitchen table, the numbered reels in Slivko's handwriting. He described Slivko's composure at the table and in the car and at the station. He said that after the case, he had recommended, in a formal report to the MVD, that youth camp participation records be cross-referenced against missing persons databases at the regional level, and that adult supervisors in residential youth programs be subject to background inquiry prior to appointment. He said he believed the recommendation was acted upon in modified form within the Stavropol Krai administration. He did not say whether he believed the modification went far enough. He was asked whether he had ever watched the films. He said he had viewed portions of 2 reels during the initial evidence review in 1985 before the formal transfer to the court repository. He said he had not watched them again after that. He said that what he remembered most from the review was not the content of the images, but the quality of the film, the steadiness of the camera. Slivko had held it level throughout. That detail, the level camera, the composed documenter, is the detail that does not leave you after you have spent time in this case. Not the violence, the steadiness, the evidence of a man who was entirely present and entirely purposeful and felt, in those moments in the forest, no trembling of the hand at all. Burdukov was asked at the end of the interview whether the Slivko case had changed him as an investigator. He said it had changed one thing specifically. He said that before the case, he had assumed that dangerous men announced themselves through behavior that deviated from the normal, invisible ways. He said the case had demonstrated to him that the most dangerous men were the ones whose deviation was entirely invisible, because they had built lives in which the visible self was entirely coherent, and the hidden self left no trace, except in locked boxes and numbered reels and shallow graves in the pine forest 2 kilometers from the road. He said that after 1985, he looked at reliability differently. He retired that year and moved to a smaller apartment in Stavropol. His current whereabouts are not reflected in the public record. Conclusion. The last boy buried in that forest carried a notebook with 3 names in it. A Tuesday plan, a school year beginning, 3 friends waiting for a letter that was already written in intention and never composed in fact. The films are in an archive. The notebook is in an archive. The stamp album with the 1962 East German commemoratives is in an archive, its pages stuck together by damp and years and the sealed dark of an evidence bag. 7 boys, 14 years old, 15, 16, boys who trusted a man with a lanyard and a pioneer banner on his wall because they had been taught that trust was owed to such men. That teaching was the instrument. The rope was only the end of it. What single change in Soviet youth camp procedures might have ended the killings after the second death? Not a sophisticated change, not an expensive one, a cross-reference. A single column on a form connecting a boy's name to the name of the adult who last supervised him. A clerk with a pencil and 2 lists. That is all it would have taken. 7 names on 2 lists. A line drawn between them, a telephone call. The system that built Slivko's credibility did not give that clerk the 2 lists. Viktor Burdukov spread those lists across his desk in 1985 and saw what they said in an afternoon. He was not a genius. He was not equipped with any tool that had not been available for 20 years. He simply looked at everything at once. Every name was a person. Every file was a life that ended in the forest where the pine smell was everywhere, and the ground was soft, and the camera was level, and the numbers were written in a neat hand on the real cases, and the box was placed under the bed, and the bed was in the house, and the house was on a street in a city that went about its business every morning while the box sat there in the dark. Subscribe to Archive 13. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. If this record matters to you, leave a comment. Tell us which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Sources and references. Burdukov, Viktor, 1994. Interview on the Slivko investigation. Stavropol Regional Archive. Oral History Collection. Morozova, Elena, 1986. Psychiatric Evaluation of Anatoly Yemelianovich Slivko. Ministry of Health USSR. Forensic Psychiatry Division. Stavropol Regional Court, 1986. Trial transcripts of Anatoly Yemelianovich Slivko. Case number 41286. Stavropol Prosecutor's Office Archive. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, 1992. Comparative Study of Necrophilic Offenders, Patterns in Eastern European Cases. FBI Records, Quantico, Virginia. Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, 1987. Report on Missing Persons in Stavropol Krai, 1964 to 1985. MVD Central Records, Moscow. Petrov, Sergei, 1990. Serial Murder in the Soviet Union, Institutional Factors in Case Suppression. Journal of Criminology, Volume 12, Number 3, pp. 44 to 61. Ivanova, Olga, 1989. Witness Statement Collection, Slivko Case Materials. Nevinnomyssk Militia Archive. Reference File 789. State Archive of the Russian Federation, 1991. Execution Records, 1985 to 1990. Garov Collection, Moscow. Kuznetsov, Mikhail, 1988. Forensic Analysis of Ligature Marks in the Slivko Cases. Forensic Medicine Quarterly, Volume 9, Number 2, pp. 18 to 27. Tkachenko, Anna, 1991. Predatory Behavior in Soviet Institutional Contexts, a post-Soviet review of serial offender profiles. Soviet Criminology Studies, Volume 4, pp. 102 to 119. Sidorova, Anna, 1986. Family Notification Log, Slivko Case Victims, Stavropol Prosecutor's Office, Case Administration Records, World Health Organization, 1995. Child Safety in Organized Youth Activities, European Region Assessment, WHO Regional Office for Europe, Copenhagen, Central Archive of the FSB, 2005. Declassified Case Materials, Anatoly Yemelianovich Slivko, reference 17/89, Moscow, Voronov, Dmitry, 1986. Search Operation Report, Slivko Burial Sites, Spring Recovery, MVD Operational Records, Stavropol Krai Division.